Augustia folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. What a naked letter. She sounds quite sexy. You should marry her on the condition that she communicates with you only through letters. They went to the kitchen to make tea. It smelled of phenol and washed rags. So, you don't think I should leave Citibank? You remember Madan's story about what the Japanese say when any Indian asks them for assistance? Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe I don't know. That's my answer. Decide for yourself. It's your nightmare. Or just live with it. Live with the indecision. Everyone does it all the time. You'll get used to it soon enough. Then, when you ever take any snap decisions, you'll feel odd, like withdrawal symptoms or something. He wanted to sound callous. Drupo's question had irritated him, reminded him of his own incommunicable and secret inquisitions. A friend in Madna routed all his problems and decisions to Jagadamba and boozed while waiting for her answers. Just what are you doing? Drupo had been struggling for a while with the knob of the cooking gas cylinder. They're turning modern without warning, these bastards. This is some wretched new sealing system for gas cylinders. Only my mother and that servant know how this thing opens. He gave it a typical last chance yank. The whole thing came off in his hand. God, now it's leaking. Instantly, they could both smell the gas. They stared at the lethal mouth of the cylinder for a while. Drupo began to giggle. It looks like an arsehole. We should do something about this, said Augustia. Shall we light a match? That would take care of your indecision. For one long apocalyptic second, he wanted to explode into twitching bits of blood and bone. Drupo tried to jam the head back on the mouth of the cylinder. What a wretched, typically Indian story for tomorrow's newspapers. 2 inches of the third pages. Gas cylinder bursts. 2 dead. They heard a soft but distinct click. The head seemed to have been fixed. They stared at it suspiciously. It came off because I turned the knob the wrong way. I think it's okay now, said Drupo with great doubt in his voice. Really? Then why don't you sound more confident? They looked at each other and smiled, almost guiltily. You loved science in school. Why can't you fix this? Asked Drupo. Don't talk through your arse. Since when has our education been useful? Why don't you check the Reader's Digest books you used to get to your father to buy? 1,000 things to do when you're not reading us. They might have a column on this, with diagram alongside. They sniffed the air cautiously. Augustia touched the head of the cylinder. Listen, I'm going to light a match. We came here for tea, remember? If this is leaking, we'll soon find out. You don't want this to go on leaking till tomorrow morning, do you? We could call someone, said Drupo, again dubiously. Who? Augustia pounced with the question, like a debater scoring a telling point off an opposing speaker. He then smiled and picked up the matchbox. Indecision will be your epitaph. Isn't that a line in some very noisy song that Madan plays for us all the time? Or I could lose half of my face or both my arms. Then I wouldn't have to return to Madna or think about my future or think about anything but half my face. Much simpler living. He grinned at Drupo. Wait. From Drupo a squeak of panic. Are you sure you know what you're doing? This is no time to ask profound questions, stupid. And Augustia lit the match and put the kettle on. He crouched and examined the head of the cylinder. You bastard, Drupo! The instructions are written on this thing. Turn knob north for flow of gas, east to seal cylinder, south to remove head to attach new cylinder. Didn't they teach you gas cylinder operations at Yale or Citibank? But why are the instructions in English, the language of the blood-sucking imperialists? They made our hearts weep and crippled us from appreciating our glorious heritage. I object. And like a good Bengali, I am going to write to the grievances column of the Statesman. that the instructions on a gas cylinder should be in all the 14 Indian languages recognized by the Constitution. Again, post-coital exhaustion postures on the sofas, teacups trembling in their hands, they began to laugh. Phew, that was really close, said Drupo. I think we should smoke another joint in celebration. Of course, you junkie, this would never have happened if you hadn't been so stoned. Agastya telephoned Tonic at his office. Hello, may I speak to Mr. Gopal Chowdhury, please? My name is Agastya Sen. My name is August Sen. August, April, May, June, July, August. August Sen. Hello? Tonikda? He switched to Bengali because it would irritate his cousin. Ogu here. Tonic said, just hold on a minute, and went off the line. Agastya turned to Drupo. You haven't ever met Tonic, have you? He's the most boring person in South Asia. You can only talk to him when you're stoned. I think Potakaku hates him so much because he can bore a statue into crumbling. Has it never occurred to him to change his name? Said Drupo, lying abandoned on the divan with his head beneath two cushions. Apparently he loved tonics as a child. He's the only child in recorded history to have actually liked the taste of Waterbury's compound. He used to steal extra spoonfuls. Tonic returned to the phone. Hello, Tonikda. I thought I'd see you tomorrow. Where? At home or at office? Why don't we talk about that when we meet? A few hours later, refreshed, bathed, and still stoned, they were at dinner with Agastya's uncle, who was uncommunicative that evening. His eccentricity required that he be phlegmatic at least twice a week. Agastya wanted to nettle him, for on his phlegmatic days, his uncle's sarcasm was matchless. Kaku, Drupo is also planning to quit his job. His uncle said nothing for a while, and then with his small brown eyes on Drupo, and also planning to join Tonic's vast publishing network, I hope. Oh, no, said Drupo hurriedly. I might take the civil services exam this year. Ogu is stupid. I'm not. Well, if you're really not stupid, said Agastya's uncle, trying to lean back in the straight chair, why don't you try and transfer some of your intelligence to your friend here? Then the drums began to beat. From the puja shamiana in the field beside the house, the thunder of celebration. The drummers carried on for hours, the drum hanging from the shoulder, moving steadily in front of the idol on callous feet. They were specialists, had fanned out all the way from Bengal to thousands of similar shamianas all over the country. For 4 days, the rhythm of revelry at the foot of a figure in apotheosized clay. The beat was inextricably linked in Agastya's mind with the mildness of October, late-night movies on a makeshift screen in the open air, with the mist of incense around the idol, with eating omelets and meat pies at some dhaba at 3 in the morning. When my generation was young, I don't think your father or I would have behaved with your flippancy. This was no land of plenty, and jobs were difficult to get, even for us who knew the right people for jobs. This certainly is no land of plenty now. None of us would have walked out of jobs like this. Good jobs. A government job is so secure you needn't work at all, and you can never be thrown out. And you want to leave the IAS no less, after having been just a few months in the job. Disgusting. It would have been like your father wanting to leave the Indian civil service. For what? Not for a cause. Subhash Chandra Bose or somebody like that, but to be happy. You said this morning, all I want is to be happy. What you need is a whipping. I think your father is trying to be too reasonable, sitting there at the Calcutta Raj Bhawan playing his silly games of patience. He attributes to you far more sense than you possess. You don't seem to like your place of posting because it's not Calcutta or Delhi, and it doesn't have fast food joints selling your hamburgers. You've always known security. That's why you're behaving so shallowly. You need to grow up, Ogu. You cannot remain an adolescent at 24. That's what I told him this afternoon, said Drupo, his head seeming to nod of its own volition. That in India he was trying to be the American trying to discover himself. Kindly do not interrupt me with rubbish. But Pultakaku didn't bother to look at Drupo to say this. And you've asked that tonic for a job only because it will mean that you will stay in Delhi. You don't know anything about publishing. You aren't remotely interested in it. But then you are interested in nothing, and you think that is a virtue. Agastya and Drupo moved out to have a look at the puja. Lovely mood he was in, said Drupo. Perhaps that cute servant didn't lend his arse last night to dear Pultu. They were at the gate when Pultakaku called them from the drawing room window. Ogu, Manik telephoned this evening. I gathered from his incoherence that he wants you to marry his granddaughter. He's coming here early tomorrow morning. I told him that was the only time to catch you when you were in Delhi. The drums were quiet. The plays and movies must have begun. The crush of parked cars and people determined to enjoy themselves. For the rest of the year, the men wore trousers and shirt, but for a festival, white dhoti and kurta, assertions of their ethnicity. The ubiquitous pan and cigarette stalls around the Shamiana, dabas selling egg partas and sweets, tube lights on poles, covered in colored paper to radiate a colored glow, two sari shops, even a stall for Russian books. The Soviets will overrun us, said Drupo, looking at a photograph or Gorky on a vellum edition of my apprenticeship. The Shamiana itself was dark and emanated occasional laughter. They strolled in, crowds sitting and standing, watching a mime show, heads of oil flattened hair in silhouette against the glow of the outside lights. Agastya saw the audience and remembered Madna. In Madna, at a function of this kind, the men and women would sit separately. But Drupo wasn't listening. He had stopped at the mouth of the Shamiana to read the chart of the evening's program. Agastya turned away towards the idol. Durga had been put up as usual opposite the stage, about 60 yards away. The demon Mahishasur lay bleeding at her feet, the rictus of defeat on his face. She was surrounded by incense and silk, fattened eyes and a yellow face. Two drummers, small hard men, relaxed in a corner, smoking. Year after year he had seen her tumid October face and had involuntarily heard the chants in her praise from the radio at pre-dawn and from devout lips. Give me beauty, give me victory, give me fame, you conqueror of evil. He looked up at her face, blood lips and a third eye below a clay crown of gold. She had 1,000 facets, but none had ever remotely touched him or moved him to anything which could have had the dignity of faith. We all have to believe in something or other, his father had said, but for him faith had always been festivity, watching the women in eye-blinding silk and releasing balloons against the night sky, and when with his aunts he had joined his palms in front of Durga in the perfunctory gesture of devotion. The dust of marijuana had mingled with the moistness of sweat brought on by a Calcutta evening. I bow to you, you eminent goddess. You exist in everything, in fame, in sleep, in shame, in all. Surely some devotees believed in miracles, but none seemed to importune her for peace, and he half smiled at the idol, the eyes lustrous in vengeance. Please, Jagadamba, what about happiness, Jagadamba? Please. You look very stoned, Drupo broke in. Good news. After that mime idiot stops twisting his face for laughs, they're screening a Jantrik at 10. Films all night, but the other two are Bengali pot boilers. Let's go out and get some tea. They moved off, Agastya a little startled at what he had done. He had half believed in Shankar's assertions of his world view. They sat outside a dhaba beside the road on aluminum chairs, two islands. An urchin handed them 2 half glasses of sweet tea. Agastya felt exhausted. I haven't seen a Jantrik before, have you? Prattled Drupal. Actually, this'll be my first Ritwik Gatak. Of course, he was awful until the French said he was good, and now he's a master. Why aren't you listening to me, bastard? Too stoned. Then Drupal too fell silent. They took in the scene around them, Agastya continuing to wonder at himself, cars honking 6 feet from them, helpless in the crush, the babble of happy crowds, the stench of gas from the balloon seller's stall, potato tikas frying on a giant pan, the urchins being yelled at for dawdling by a fat man who combed his hair over his ears, a young girl, self-conscious in dazzling sari and painted face, escorting an aged couple across the road, a green glow from the nearest tube light on a good-looking man at the next table. In America, I missed all this, said Drupal suddenly, his hand drawing aimless circles. But Agastya didn't hear and continued to look around. Then, clapping from within the shamiana, the lights came on. The usual after the show stirrings, rustles, and murmurs, then a voice over the PA system in Bengali. We were to screen Ritwik Gatak's Ajantrik at 10 o'clock, but many of our friends have expressed a wish to see the other two films scheduled for tonight first, so Ajantrik is postponed to 4 in the morning. A roar of approval from within the shamiana. Some people outside clapped. The announcer raised his voice. We'll start the first film at 10:30 to give some time to those who want to inform others of this rescheduling. The crowds moved out, the babble increased. Somewhere a child bawled, So much for the master, said Drupal with a laugh. You want to stay till 4? No, said Drupal. Let's just sit here for some time. This whole noise and chaos is nice. Maybe have another tea, then we'll move. 1 in the morning, he was on the roof of the house. Drupal had left an hour before. Through the eucalyptuses, he could see the puja ground. The crowds had thinned. He could hear snatches of the film dialogue. The tops of the trees stood silent against the stars. 1 day gone, 7.5 to go. He didn't want to sleep. That would be 6 hours wasted. Perhaps it was raining in Madna, soothing night rain. The room would be silent, his cassettes on the table slowly gathering dust. He remembered Renu's letter and half smiled. She needn't have gone so far to suffer so much. The inhabitants of his world moved so much, ceaselessly and without sanity, and realized only with the last flicker of their reason that they had not lived. Endless movement, much like the uncaring sea, transfers to alien places, passages to distant shores, looking for luck, not sensing that heaven was in their minds. I was not born for this, said Agastya silently. He had said that all he wanted was to be happy. Now alone under the stars he could admit this to himself without embarrassment. His father and Drupal had prophesied that the experience of Madna would prove educative. But all that his mind seemed to have learned was the impotence of restlessness. He had begun to be appalled by thoughts that scurried in his mind uncontrollably like rats in a damp cavern. Thought without action. And Madna had tainted his old world here in the city. The crowds at the puja had reminded him of the Madna Club. Durga had recalled Jagadamba. It was too much to endure the load of more than one world in the head. 3:30 in the morning, laughter on the roads, happy people going home after seeing 2-pot boilers free. He sat in a corner of the roof on the cold cement and brick, watching a blue-white austere moon. He was woken up next morning by a man whom for a moment he didn't recognize. Bald and skeletal, a thin skin stretched taut across the face, large spectacles on a skull grinning with nervous glee. Ah, Ogu! It giggled and said in Bengali, Your uncle was right. The only way to meet you is to catch you in the morning. Oh, Manik Kaku. Hello. Agastya sat up, his head throbbing for more sleep. wondering whether he should display his morning erection to send the old man away. Slept late last night, puja nights. He followed him out to the lawn. 10 in the morning, his uncle was reading his own article in the Statesman with scorn. I told Manik to wake you up. He's been here since 8, giving me details of his incomparable granddaughter. I told him it wasn't a good idea since you were about to leave the IAS to join a publishing firm. Manik laughed shrilly, a sheen of sweat on his head. The servant brought tea. Agastya said, Baba wrote that you met him in Calcutta. His mouth tasted foul, a mix of mucus and dung, and now tea. Yes, said Manik. I did. Your father was as nice as ever. He doesn't forget old friends. What does your granddaughter do, Kaku? I haven't met her ever. In fact, I met you last at least 10 years ago. Yes, said Manik, his head jerking in indecision, vacillating between slurping over his tea and beaming at Agastya. Of course, my granddaughter was a mere child then. So was I, simpered Agastya. I knew nothing of the world those days, except that if you unrolled a condom to find out how big adult cocks were, you could get very worried. Yes, said Manik, again yellow teeth in a bespectacled skull. He would, decided Agastya, die right there saying yes. My granddaughter is 20 now, doing her MA in Calcutta. English, a very fine subject. Keats and Tennyson, very good, for girls especially. You mean it's a distinct advantage in the marriage market, said Pultakaku, smiling viciously, his torso hidden by his newspaper. Then your advertisement in the matrimonial columns can say, convent educated, MA in English, and when you exhibit her in the drawing rooms of her husbands-to-be, she can, after singing the mandatory Tagore song, recite The Lady of Shalott. And if she marries an IAS officer at all district parties, she can be even more condescending than the average Madame IAS. And when the prominent citizens call on them in some god-forsaken subdivision, while the husband makes them wait the obligatory 40 minutes, she can talk to them about Lakhnivar. The newspaper then moved up to cover his face. It was his day for misanthropy. I don't really want to marry now. Besides, I really might be changing jobs, Kaku, in which case you certainly won't be interested. He waited for the old man's protest, but there was none. Perhaps we could discuss this later or something. In his state of mind, marriage was awfully remote, like a death in a road accident. It was something that happened to other people. It was inconceivable, sharing his room in Madna with some unknown, perhaps a 20-year-old girl with an MA in English, and getting stoned in front of her to read Marcus Aurelius, while Manik chatted with Pultakaku and elicited from him a few misanthropic monosyllables, the familiar feeling of the absurd, as much a part of him as his names overwhelmed Agastya, and he wondered whether, when married, he would be able to exercise in front of his wife, and what he would do if, just when he was lunging for a push-up, she were to say, for someone who exercises so much, you're in awful shape. And suppose she stole his money? And all the important subject of kinky sex, she might not like sharing each other's used underwear then. Eventually, he knew he would marry, perhaps not out of passion, but out of convention, which was probably a safer thing. And then, in either case, in a few months or years, they would tire of disagreeing with each other, or what was more or less the same thing, would be inured to each other's odd and perhaps disgusting ways, the way she squeezed the tube of toothpaste and the way he drank from a glass and didn't rinse it, and they would slide into a placid and comfortable unhappiness, and maybe unseeingly watch TV every evening, each still a cocoon, but perhaps it would be unwise to be otherwise, and his one secret life would be entombed in a mind half dead to an incarcerating world, and he would remember with a sense of bemused embarrassment and in epiphanic flashes brought on by uncontrollable jolts to his memory through a smell or some unexpected sight, perhaps the view from a train or an ad on TV. His experience of Madna, that once the restlessness of his mind had seemed the most important thing in the universe, that he had once shaken that he had once been shaken by the profundity of an ancient Hindu poem. On the day to Tonic's office, he dropped Manikaku off at some convenient point with shallow promises to write to him from Madna. Agustia watched him cross the road, Doti billowing around stick legs. Tonic's office was about 15 kilometers away from home. At a red light, he decided, while eyeing a neighboring Fiat painted an impossible red, that he wasn't going to do this journey every day. He wondered why he was going to meet Tonic. He didn't particularly want to work with him. On the day of the picnic at Gorapak, he had written to his father from an abyss. He had wanted to explode with his irresolution once and for all. But now it seemed preposterous to change one bridle for another. A bus overtook him, with office goers hanging out of the door like tongues out of a canine mouths. I'd be one of them, he thought. I certainly won't be paid enough for the amount of petrol this senile monster, he was driving his uncle's decayed ambassador, guzzles. And then 9 every morning he'd be rushing for a bus, lunch packet or tiffin carrier in his hand. He'd queue up sweating at the bus stop, but still stand all the way in the stench of engine oil and bus sweat, like the stench of that antibiotic capsule he had had in Madna when he'd been ill. And his questions would contract to whether he would be able to catch his most convenient bus, and whether he would get a seat on it, and the bus timings would be down on a slip of paper in his table drawer and would be embossed in his mind. Any unannounced change in them would be cataclysmic, and his wonderful days would be those in which he got a seat both ways. Unlike many others of his age and in his time, he did not have to job hunt. Unlike them, he had never known the suspense of financial insecurity. But he envied them the concreteness of their worries, these office goers who had to hang out of buses like tongues, and felt guilty about the envy. Nira would have instantly demonstrated in her strident Marxist way that his envy was a symptom of a despicable something or the other. There wasn't a single thought in his head, he smiled at the back of the bus ahead of him, about which he didn't feel confused. His mind was always coercing a pattern out of his past, but the attempts towards order led nowhere. Drupo, for instance, was as closed about his Yale experience as he himself was about Madna. But getting chaos to cohere in this fashion was really a fruitless exercise, just a sport for the mind like chess or his father's games of patience. His father's addiction to patience was quite inexplicable. His mother had taught it to him, but his father always defended the game with great conviction. It teaches us something important, Ogu, that order cannot be achieved without patience. Balls, Augustia had thought, but hadn't said so. Suddenly he didn't want to finish like his father either, alone in his spare time reading the Katha Upanishad in the vast rooms of a Raj Bhavan. He parked and walked. He passed Macmillan's and the Oxford University Press, huge show windows proudly displaying lethally dull titles. Tonic's publishing firm was on the second floor of a pink building in a side street. Tonic was in his cubicle, filling his pipe and ignoring his work, a slim but soft man with a double chin and bulbous eyes. "Ah, you aren't serious, are you?" He always began directly and thereby, for a few seconds, impressed those who didn't know him with a sense of his efficiency. "No, not really." Tonic frowned at his answer. Perhaps it deprived him of a reason for talking non-stop. but Agastya wanted to provide him with a takeoff point and said, Baba said, you said that I dislike a small town because I've always lived in big cities and never knew what the rest of India is like. Ah, Tonic lit his pipe as though he was in an ad for something romantically masculine, aftershave or cigarette lighters. Perhaps he would suddenly change his clothes, wear something terribly sporty, and go off in a red car with some Bombay females to play golf. Then on the road, hopefully, a truck would eat up the arse of the red car, and the truck driver would beat up Tonic for lighting a pipe like that. Ah, India lives in its villages. A terrible cliche that, but really very true, like all cliches. Wittgenstein, wasn't it, who said that India lives in its villages? No, Gandhi. A subordinate came in. Before he could open his mouth, Tonic said, Oh, yes, I remember, I'll get that done. It'll take me no time at all. It's really very easy, but it keeps slipping my mind. I've been terribly busy. But don't worry, I'll see to it. The subordinate left. Tonic blew rich smoke after him. Ah, people like you, Ogu, really have no idea of what the real India is like. Especially you. South Delhi is such a vulgar place, and your only companion there is Pultakaku. You are bound to get an insane perspective on the real things. Appalling poverty and even more appalling ignorance. But then, look at our education system. Oh, how he loved to talk. He leaned back to pick up a manuscript from a side table. Dr. Prem Krishan of Meerut University has written a book on E.M. Forster, India's darling Englishman. Most of us seem to be so grateful that he wrote that novel about India. Dr. Prem Krishan holds a PhD on Jane Austen from Meerut University. Have you ever been to Meerut? A vile place, but comfortably Indian. What is Jane Austen doing in Meerut? Or Macbeth in Ulhasnagar, and Wordsworth in Azmaganj? No, nothing. Do go on. We are publishing Prem Krishan because he'll fetch us lots of money. His book is entirely in a question and answer form. The students lapped that up. Tonic lit his pipe again. Agastya again thought of the truck driver beating him up. Why is some Jat teenager in Meerut reading Jane Austen? Why does a place like Meerut have a course in English at all? Only because the Prem Christians of the country need a place where they can teach this rubbish? He jabbed dramatically at the manuscript with his pipe. Surely they can spend the money they waste on running the department usefully elsewhere. Tonic fixed his bulbous eyes on Agastya to see whether he had understood, or perhaps to discourage his smile. That's why education is a real challenge, and in the years to come, as a bureaucrat, you'll be in a position to do something about these things, things that matter, and yet you want to leave the IAS for callow reasons, just because in Madina you don't see the girls that you see in Delhi and Bombay, in their arse-hugging jeans and t-shirts with lewd one-liners. Agastya was angry with himself for looking like the sort of person to whom such things could be said. Tonic asked for tea. Another subordinate entered and exited after extracting from Tonic furious promises of immediate action. Look, Ogu, I can give you a job anytime, but you need to think a lot about this thing. You haven't really thought about this. I can see that on your face. Agastya felt angry with his face. Leaving such a job is a ridiculously high price to pay for trying to regain some of the shallow pleasures of your past life. Agastya left with his mind in a whirl. It confused him even more when people he held in affectionate contempt talked down to him and talked sense. At home, over lunch, Agastya told his uncle that he probably wasn't joining Tonic. Pultakaku said, any person who is not insane would conclude the same, especially after one look at Tonic in his office. He functions as though he is paid to be a leaking balloon, emit hot air. After lunch, contemplating a nap, the phone rang. Agastya picked it up. Hello? Hello, is that Delhi? Mr. Agastya Sen, will you kindly hold on, please? The governor wishes to speak to you. A few transnational clicks and short screeches then. Hello, is that Ogu? Agastya warmed to the voice, firm even when distant. Hi, how's the patients? I met Tonic this morning. He gave himself a pep talk and sent me away. I see. So, I don't know anything, Baba. I'll go back to Madna and try and get used to things. A pause. Yes, Ogu, do that. At least see your training through before deciding anything. All these months you've just been moving from office to office. Now you're going to be block development officer, and that is sure to prove more interesting. Yes, I suppose I should do that. He felt an emptiness well upwards from his scrotum, like blood that would not be stanched. And Ogu? He could see his father perfectly, white hair on a thinning scalp, small golden spectacles, dhoti and kurta of cream silk, up since 5 in the morning, wringing out from each day its pith, the impress of Marcus Aurelius and the Reader's Digest on his face. I wish I could be of help, but you must already have been so bothered by Pultu and his sarcasm. But try and ignore everything so that your mind is clear, and think and decide for yourself. And a little later, will you put Pultu on? I want to quarrel with him about a few things. 6 in the evening, Agastya and Drupa went to meet Madan, an old college friend. On the way, Drupa cursed the traffic of West Delhi. You wouldn't think such a mess existed 10 kilometers away from south of Delhi's colonies. Madan's father, who had just returned from another mysterious business trip to Singapore, continued the theme. Singapore is so organized, I tell you. The traffic's so ordered, and no spitting and urinating on the road, and no restaurants with signs saying, "Don't wash your hands in the glass." An Indian couldn't survive there. And this place, my blood pressure goes up every time I sit behind the wheel. He was a jovial and extremely ugly man. Madan looked different. He had cut his hair and wasn't wearing his terribly faded jeans. Because of this damn job, I have to look clean every day. He had recently joined a reputable firm of chartered accountants. Come, let's shift to my room, which was a college euphemism for smoking marijuana. Later, suitably high, Madan said, "It's sick, I think, having a job, having to work. Your whole day is gone. The one thing worse than a CA firm will be a bank, I think." He looked at Drupo and laughed. Bloody Oedipus, Drupo. How does it feel sitting all day behind a desk and counting other people's money? My sister's going to Oxford. She's got the Rhodes Scholarship this year. She's already picked up an accent from somewhere and says, "Pardon," and "thanks awfully" at everything. Bitch. Now she roams around looking for people who've been to Blighty. She stopped calling it England. I'm deeply ashamed of her. I told her to ring up the British High Commission and find out how people shit at Oxford, whether in vases or ladies' handbags, because all over the world people, I said, have different habits. The stupid girl went to whine to my mother, who stunned her by taking my side, because my mother's sulking ever since my sister refused to take 2 huge jars of pickle with her. Madan lay down. Every day in the office I feel as though my head is being raped, like somebody's pushing his cock in through my ears and is moving it around in my brain, mixing his semen in my brain matter. Do you two ever feel like that? Do you remember Bhatia from college? He was on our hostel floor, wore t-shirts which said things like, "I'm the best lover in town," and spoke American slang all the time. Well, he's in Madna, in forest service. Serves him right. I hope he's feeling at least as fucked as he's looked, said Madan. Well, what's Madna like? What are you doing there for sex? You don't know what a BDO is, but I'm sharing one with my collector. She's exhaustingly oversexed, like a case for Kraft Ebbing. Thus the three talked on, desultorily. Their mouths seemed to work on their own, forming syllables seemingly independent of their minds. None of them paid much attention to the other two. Each wanted to talk, but not fervently. It was as though some time had to be passed, and it passed least taxingly when one talked, because to keep silent meant that one had either to listen or to think. And Augustia didn't mind particularly. He had no wish to expose the confusion of his soul. They wouldn't be interested for one thing. Then, like tonic that morning, they would demolish its nobility by a few careless words. Already he realized that most of what he thought and felt was rather trite and not remotely unique. Batia, for instance, was out of place in Madna too, and Madan didn't like his job either. Felt he was wasting time in it, and knew of no alternatives. No emotion was sacredly his own, and he half hoped that his restlessness would thus succumb to attrition. Perhaps his mind would finally realize that its disquietude was merely an index of its immaturity, as inevitable a sign of growing up as the first emission of semen, as universal as excrement, and about as noteworthy. "There's an American woman staying with us for a while," said Madan. "Christine something. She says she likes being called Christ. She's the daughter of some shady business connection of my father. 30-ish, damn sexy. She's fucking a Kenyan called Hungu. He studies management at the university. He looks as though he has a big cock. I think he hates me, but he also hates all Indians. Your Kraft Ebbing reminded me of them. Skin fetishism. She's quite hateful, goes on and on about the real India and how people all over the world don't know enough of one another, as though that was in any way important or desirable. My fault. I led her on the topic the day she arrived. She comes from Chicago. How was I to know that someone studies ancient Indian history over there? She says they do. All I knew about Chicago was Al Capone. That started her off. How ignorant I was, and how people from all over the world should meet to remove this ignorance of one another, and how there should be more interaction. Judging from her behavior, I think she meant intercourse. She knows a lot about India too, the bitch. She's leaving tomorrow or day after for a place called Lothal for some research, and then she shrieked when I asked her where it was. Then she went on and on about Indians being blind to their own history, apart from being blind to the world outside. She says all the time that all we read in books about other cultures, etc., is just rubbish, and people in different countries get horribly distorted views of one another through books and films. I think she works for the CIA. She kept using my Al Capone remark as an example, saying, see, that's all that you know about America. Then I said Lionel Richie. Now she doesn't talk to me much. They went on for a drive, after Madan went to the kitchen to buy some more marijuana from his servant. Drupo cursed the traffic till they stopped in one of the parking lots of Rajendra Place. Guarded by the dark blocks of offices, they heard the horns screaming at one another 30 meters away and felt safe on an island, as on an island. Madan slowly rolled a smoke in the light from a street mercury lamp, and Drupo changed Scott Joplin for Keith Jarrett. Outwardly, it could have been almost any day of the past 6 years. Office warrants look nice only after dark, said Drupo. Every encounter with West Delhi seemed to sour him further. Every morning, won't this place also get execs like me who in their spare time browse through the Wall Street Journal on the occasional time? I suppose Business India in their case, and India Today. You must always say Time and Newsweek, otherwise Newsweek will feel hurt, said Madan, who, like a craftsman, was checking the shape of the joint against the street light. August, Drupo must have told you about how he's feeling unreal. He makes it sound awful. Stupid man, I wish I could feel unreal. Entirely his foolishness, of course, and varieties of foolishness. He's bothered that He's bothered that everything doesn't hang together. Yale and your damn Durga Puja. A real idiot. And because he can't manage by himself, he must make demands on someone else's life. And that Renu, you never met her, did you? She looked as though her puss smelled of and told me she looked as though her pussy smelled and told me she was a very private person. I thought that meant she was willing to hump anyone would think the same at such a remark, but she didn't. Amazing. Sex should be like a male stray dog. Sex should be like male stray dogs, no hassles, with lots and lots of condoms. And Drupo shows his letters to all his friends, behaving like that American Lothal woman, as though the world's a Reader's Digest place, and everyone is dying to be nice to everyone else. Jared played on, proximate piano against the cacophony of traffic. A constable walked out of the dark beret khaki in daylight, overcoat and a thigh-high stick, and straight up to the car. Drupo didn't even have time to lower the joint, but amazingly Madan knew him and chatted with him, cordially and obscenely, in Punjabi. The constable smoked that joint with them and left after Madan gave him another joint's worth of marijuana. Agastya drove on the way back, while Drupo communed with Keith Jarrett and Madan fantasized aloud. I'd like to be someone's mistress, I think. A flat, money, a video, nice underwear. The days passed so fast for Agastya, he woke up with the day almost half gone. At brunch, he would remember the food of Madna, and then overeat as though he could store up. He played chess with his uncle or listened to music in his room. He talked to his father almost every evening and told him that he'd take a holiday in Calcutta after his training. He met Drupo and Madan every day. They didn't go anywhere in particular or do anything. They just relaxed, mostly in Drupo's house, and talked without listening. He jogged at odd hours of the day. The days passed so fast, but the nights were slower. At night, he would lie awake and hear the clack of his uncle's typewriter and watch the dark shape of the bougainvillea outside the window and see in its twists and turns a million things, but never his future.